can grant special leave to an appeal from any judgment or matter passed by any court in the territory of India. Original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means cases that can be directly considered by the Supreme Court without going to the lower courts before that. From the diagram above, you will notice that cases involving federal relations go directly to the Supreme Court. The original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court establishes it as an umpire in all disputes regarding federal matters. In any federal country, legal disputes are bound to arise between the Union and the states, and among the states themselves. The power to resolve such cases is entrusted to the Supreme Court of India. It is called original jurisdiction because the Supreme Court alone has the power to deal with such cases. Neither the high courts nor the lower courts can deal with such cases. In this capacity, the Supreme Court not just settles disputes but also interprets the powers of union and state government as laid down in the Constitution. Writ jurisdiction. As you have already studied in the chapter on fundamental rights, any individual, whose fundamental right has been violated, can directly move the Supreme Court for remedy. The Supreme Court can give special orders in the form of writs. The high courts can also issue writs, but the persons whose rights are violated have the choice of either approaching the high court or approaching the Supreme Court directly. Through such writs, the court can give orders to the executive to act or not to act in a particular way. Appellate jurisdiction. The Supreme Court is the highest court of appeal. A person can appeal to the Supreme Court against the decisions of the High Court. However, High Court must certify that the case is fit for appeal, that is to say that it involves a serious matter of interpretation of law or constitution. In addition, in criminal cases, if the lower court has sentenced a person to death, then an appeal can be made to the High Court or Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court holds the powers to decide whether to admit appeals even when appeal is not allowed by the High Court. Appellate jurisdiction means that the Supreme Court will reconsider the case and the legal issues involved in it. If the court thinks that the law or the Constitution has a different meaning from what the lower courts understood, then the Supreme Court will change the ruling and along with that also give new interpretation of the provision involved. The high courts, too, have appellate jurisdiction over the decisions given by courts below them. Advisory jurisdiction. In addition to original and appellate jurisdiction, the Supreme Court of India possesses advisory jurisdiction also. This means that the President of India can refer any matter that is of public importance or that which involves interpretation of Constitution to Supreme Court for advice. However, the Supreme Court is not bound to give advice on such matters and the President is not bound to accept such an advice. What then is the utility of the advisory powers of the Supreme Court? The utility is twofold. In the first place, it allows the government to seek legal opinion on a matter of importance before taking action on it. This may prevent unnecessary litigations later. Secondly, in the light of the advice of the Supreme Court, the government can make suitable changes in its action or legislations. Article 137. 4. The Supreme Court shall have power to review any judgment pronounced or order made by it. Article 144. 4. All authorities, civil and judicial, in the territory of India shall act in aid of the Supreme Court. Read the articles quoted above. These articles help us to understand the unified nature of our judiciary and the powers of the Supreme Court. Decisions made by the Supreme Court are binding on all other courts within the territory of India. Orders passed by it are enforceable throughout the length and breadth of the country. The Supreme Court itself is not bound by its decision and can at any time review it. Besides, if there is a case of contempt of the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court itself decides such a case. Judicial activism. Have you heard of the term judicial activism? Or public interest litigation? Both these terms are often used in the discussions about judiciary in recent times. Many people think that these two things have revolutionized the functioning of judiciary and made it more people-friendly. The chief instrument through which judicial activism has flourished in India is public interest litigation, PIL, or social action litigation, SAL. What is PIL or SAL? How and when did it emerge? In normal course of law, an individual can approach the courts only if she has been personally aggrieved. That is to say, a person whose rights have been violated, or who is involved in a dispute, could move the court of law. This concept underwent a change around 1979. In 1979, the court set the trend when it decided to hear a case where the case was filed not by the aggrieved persons but by others on their behalf. As this case involved a consideration of an issue of public interest, it and such other cases came to be known as public interest litigations. Around the same time, the Supreme Court also took up the case about rights of prisoners. This opened the gates for large number of cases where public-spirited citizens and voluntary organizations sought judicial intervention for protection of existing rights, betterment of life conditions of the poor, protection of the environment, and many other issues in the interest of the public. PIL has become the most important vehicle of judicial activism. Judiciary, which is an institution that traditionally confined to responding to cases brought before it, began considering many cases merely on the basis of newspaper reports and postal complaints received by the court. Therefore, the term judicial activism became the more popular description of the role of the judiciary. Some early PILs. In 1979, newspapers published reports about under trials. There were many prisoners in Bihar who had spent long years in jail, longer than what they would have spent if they had been punished for the offenses for which they were arrested. This report prompted an advocate to file a petition. The Supreme Court heard this case. It became famous as one of the early public interest litigations PILs. This was the Hussainara Khatun vs. Bihar case. In 1980, a prison inmate of the Tihar jail managed to send a scribbled piece of paper to Justice Krishna Iyer of the Supreme Court narrating physical torture of the prisoners. The judge got it converted into a petition. Though later on, the court abandoned the practice of considering letters. This case, known as Sunil Batra vs. Delhi Administration, 1980, also became one of the pioneers of public interest litigation. Through the PIL, the court has expanded the idea of rights. Clean air, unpolluted water, decent living, etc., are rights for the entire society. Therefore, it was felt by the courts that individuals as parts of the society must have the right to seek justice wherever such rights were violated. Secondly, through PIL and judicial activism of the post-1980 period, the judiciary has also shown readiness to take into consideration rights of those sections who cannot easily approach the courts. For this purpose, the judiciary allowed public-spirited citizens, social organizations and lawyers to file petitions on behalf of the needy and the deprived. It must be remembered that the problems of the poor are qualitatively different from those which have hitherto occupied the attention of the court, and they need a different kind of judicial approach. If we blindly follow the adversarial procedure in their case, they would never be able to enforce their fundamental rights. Justice Bhagwati and Bandhua Mukti Morcha vs. Union of India, 1984. Activity. Find out the details about at least one case involving a PIL and study the way in which that case helped in serving public interest. Judicial activism has had manifold impact on the political system. It has democratized the judicial system by giving not just to individuals but also groups access to the courts. It has forced executive accountability. It has also made an attempt to make the electoral system much more free and fair. The court asked candidates contesting elections to file affidavits indicating their assets and income along with educational qualifications so that the people could elect their representatives based on accurate knowledge. There is, however, a negative side to the large number of PILs and the idea of a proactive judiciary. In the first place, it has overburdened the courts. Secondly, judicial activism has blurred the line of distinction between the executive and legislature on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. The court has been involved in resolving questions which belong to the executive. Thus, for instance, reducing air or sound pollution or investigating cases of corruption or bringing about electoral reform is not exactly the duty of the judiciary. These are matters to be handled by the administration under the supervision of the legislatures. Therefore, some people feel that judicial activism has made the balance among the three organs of government very delicate. Democratic government is based on each organ of government respecting the powers and jurisdiction of the others. Judicial activism may be creating strains on this democratic principle. You are a judge. A group of citizens from a city have approached the court through a bill asking for an order to the city municipal authorities to remove slums and beautify the city in order to attract investors to the city. They argue that this is in the public interest. The residents of the slum localities have responded by saying that this will encroach on their right to life. They argue that right to life is more central to public interest than the right to a clean city. Imagine that you are the judge. Write a judgment deciding if the bill involves public interest. Judiciary and rights. We have already seen that the judiciary is entrusted with the task of protecting rights of individuals. The Constitution provides two ways in which the Supreme Court can remedy the violation of rights. 1. First, it can restore fundamental rights by issuing writs of habeas corpus, mandamus, etc. Article 32. The High Courts also have the power to issue such writs, Article 226. 2. Secondly, the Supreme Court can declare the concerned law as unconstitutional and therefore non-operational, Article 13. Together, these two provisions of the Constitution establish the Supreme Court as the protector of fundamental rights of the citizen on the one hand and interpreter of Constitution on the other. The second of the two ways mentioned above involves judicial review. Perhaps the most important power of the Supreme Court is the power of judicial review. Judicial review means the power of the Supreme Court, or High Courts, to examine the constitutionality of any law if the court arrives at the conclusion that the law is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution. Such a law is declared as unconstitutional and inapplicable. The term judicial review is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. However, the fact that India has a written constitution and the Supreme Court can strike down a law that goes against fundamental rights, implicitly gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. Besides, as we saw in the section on jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, in the case of federal relations too, the Supreme Court can use the review powers if a law is inconsistent with the distribution of powers laid down by the Constitution. Suppose the central government makes a law, which according to some states, concerns a subject from the state list. Then the states can go to the Supreme Court, and if the court agrees with them, it would declare that the law is unconstitutional. In this sense, the review power of the Supreme Court includes power to review legislations on the ground that they violate fundamental rights or on the ground that they violate the federal distribution of powers. The review power extends to the laws passed by state legislatures also. Together, the writ powers and the review power of the court make judiciary very powerful. In particular, the review power means that the judiciary can interpret the Constitution and the laws passed by the legislature. Many people think that this feature enables the judiciary to protect the Constitution effectively and also to protect the rights of citizens. The practice of entertaining pills has further added to the powers of the judiciary in protecting rights of citizens. Did you know that the practice of public interest litigation is now becoming more and more acceptable in many other countries? While many courts across the world, particularly in South Asia and Africa, practice some form of judicial activism comparable to that of the Indian judiciary, the Constitution of South Africa has incorporated public interest litigation in its Bill of Rights. Thus, in South Africa, it is a fundamental right of the citizen to bring before the Constitutional Court cases of violation of other persons' rights. Do you remember that in the chapter on rights we mentioned the right against exploitation? This right prohibits forced labor, trade in human flesh, and prohibits employment of children in hazardous jobs. But the question is, how could those, whose rights were violated, approach the court? Pill and judicial activism made it possible for courts to consider these violations. Thus, the court considered a whole set of cases: the blinding of the jail inmates by the police, inhuman working conditions in stone quarries, sexual exploitation of children, and so on. This trend has made rights really meaningful for the poor sections. Check your progress. 1. When does the court use the review powers? 2. What is the difference between judicial review and writ? Judiciary and Parliament. Apart from taking a very active stand on the matter of rights, the court has been active in seeking to prevent subversion of the Constitution through political practice. Thus, areas that were considered beyond the scope of judicial review, such as powers of the president and governor, were brought under the purview of the courts. There are many other instances in which the Supreme Court actively involved itself in the administration of justice by giving directions to executive agencies. Thus, it gave directions to CBI to initiate investigations against politicians and bureaucrats in the Hawala case, the Narasimha Rao case, illegal allotment of petrol pumps case, etc. You may have heard about some of these cases. Many of these instances are the products of judicial activism. The Indian Constitution is based on a delicate principle of limited separation of powers and checks and balances. This means that each organ of the government has a clear area of functioning. Thus, the Parliament is supreme in making laws and amending the Constitution, the executive is supreme in implementing them, while the judiciary is supreme in settling disputes and deciding whether the laws that have been made are in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. Despite such clear-cut division of power, the conflict between the Parliament and judiciary, and executive and the judiciary has remained a recurrent theme in Indian politics. We have already mentioned the differences that emerged between the Parliament and the judiciary over right to property and the Parliament's power to amend the Constitution. Let us recapitulate that briefly. Immediately after the implementation of the Constitution began, a controversy arose over the Parliament's power to restrict right to property. The Parliament wanted to put some restrictions on the right to hold property so that land reforms could be implemented. The court held that the Parliament cannot thus restrict fundamental rights. The Parliament then tried to amend the Constitution. But the court said that even through an amendment, a fundamental right cannot be abridged. The following issues were at the center of the controversy between the Parliament and the judiciary. 1. What is the scope of right to private property? 2. What is the scope of the Parliament's power to curtail, abridge or abrogate fundamental rights? 3. What is the scope of the Parliament's power to amend the Constitution? 4. Can the Parliament make laws that abridge fundamental rights while enforcing directive principles? During the period 1967 and 1973, this controversy became very serious. Apart from land reform laws, laws enforcing preventive detention, laws governing reservations in jobs, regulations acquiring private property for public purposes, and laws deciding the compensation for such acquisition of private property were some instances of the conflict between the legislature and the judiciary. In 1973, the Supreme Court gave a decision that has become very important in regulating the relations between the Parliament and the judiciary since then. This case is famous as the Kesavananda Bharati case. In this case, the court ruled that there is a basic structure of the Constitution and nobody, not even the Parliament through amendment, can violate the basic structure. The court did two more things. First, it said that right to property, the disputed issue, was not part of basic structure and therefore could be suitably abridged. Secondly, the court reserved to itself the right to decide whether various matters are part of the basic structure of the Constitution. This case is perhaps the best example of how judiciary uses its power to interpret the Constitution. This ruling has changed the nature of conflicts between the legislature and the judiciary. As we studied earlier, the right to property was taken away from the list of fundamental rights in 1979, and this also helped in changing the nature of the relationship between these two organs of government. Some issues still remain a bone of contention between the two. Can the judiciary intervene in and regulate the functioning of the legislatures? In the parliamentary system, the legislature has the power to govern itself and regulate the behavior of its members. Thus, the legislature can punish a person who the legislature holds guilty of breaching privileges of the legislature. Can a person who is held guilty for breach of parliamentary privileges seek protection of the courts? Can a member of the legislature against whom the legislature has taken disciplinary action get protection from the court? These issues are unresolved and are matters of potential conflict between the two. Similarly, the Constitution provides that the conduct of judges cannot be discussed in the Parliament. There have been several instances where the Parliament and state legislatures have cast aspersions on the functioning of the judiciary. Similarly, the judiciary too has criticized the legislatures and issued instructions to the legislatures about the conduct of legislative business. The legislatures see this as violating the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. These issues indicate how delicate the balance between any two organs of the government is and how important it is for each organ of the government in a democracy to respect the authority of others. Check your progress. The main issues in the conflict between the judiciary and the Parliament have been 1. Appointment of judges. 2. Salaries and allowances of judges. 3. Scope of Parliament's power to amend the Constitution. 4. Interference by the Parliament in the functioning of the Judiciary Constituent Assembly debate. 1. While there can be no two opinions on the need for the maintenance of judicial independence, it is also necessary to keep in view one important principle. The doctrine of independence is not to be raised to the level of a dogma so as to enable the judiciary to function as a kind of super-legislature or super-executive. The judiciary is there to interpret the Constitution or adjudicate upon the rights. Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, CAD, Volume 11, p. 837, the 23rd of November 1949. Conclusion. In this chapter, we have studied the role of the judiciary in our democratic structure. In spite of the tensions that arose from time to time between the judiciary and the executive and the legislature, the prestige of the judiciary has increased considerably. At the same time, there are many more expectations from the judiciary. Ordinary citizens also wonder how it is possible for many people to get easy acquittals and how witnesses change their testimonies to suit the wealthy and the mighty. These are some issues about which our judiciary is concerned too. You have seen in this chapter that judiciary in India is a very powerful institution. This power has generated much awe and many hopes from it. Judiciary in India is also known for its independence. Through various decisions, the judiciary has given new interpretations to the Constitution and protected the rights of citizens. As we saw in this chapter, democracy hinges on the delicate balance of power between the judiciary and the Parliament, and both institutions have to function within the limitations set by the Constitution. Exercises. 1. What are the different ways in which the independence of the judiciary is ensured? Choose the odd ones out. 0. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is consulted in the appointment of other judges of Supreme Court. 1. Judges are generally not removed before the age of retirement. 2. Judge of a high court cannot be transferred to another high court. 3. Parliament has no say in the appointment of judges. 2. Does independence of the judiciary mean that the judiciary is not accountable to anyone? Write your answer in not more than 100 words. 3. What are the different provisions in the Constitution in order to maintain the independence of judiciary? 4. Read the news report below and identify the following aspects. A. What is the case about? B. Who has been the beneficiary in the case? C. Who is the petitioner in the case? D. Visualize what would have been the different arguments put forward by the company. E. What arguments would the farmers have put forward? Supreme Court orders REL to pay 300 crore rupees to Dahanu farmers. Our Corporate Bureau, the 24th of March 2005. Mumbai, the Supreme Court has ordered Reliance Energy to pay Rs. 300 crore to farmers who grow the chiku fruit in the Dahanu area outside Mumbai. The order comes after the chiku growers petitioned the court against the pollution caused by Reliance's thermal power plant. Dahanu, which is 150 kilometers from Mumbai, was a self-sustaining agricultural and horticultural economy known for its fisheries and forests just over a decade ago, but was devastated in 1989 when a thermal power plant came into operation in the region. The next year, this fertile belt saw its first crop failure. Now, 70% of the crop of what was once the fruit bowl of Maharashtra is gone. The fisheries have shut and the forest cover has thinned. Farmers and environmentalists say that fly ash from the power plant entered groundwater and polluted the entire ecosystem. The Dahanu Taluka Environment Protection Authority ordered the thermal station to set up a pollution control unit to reduce sulfur emissions, and in spite of a Supreme Court order backing the order, the pollution control plant was not set up even by 2002. In 2003, Reliance acquired the thermal station and resubmitted a schedule for installation process in 2004. As the pollution control plant is still not set up, the Dahanu Taluka Environmental Protection Authority asked Reliance for a bank guarantee of Rs. 300 crores. 7. Read the following news report and 0. Identify the governments at different levels. 1. Identify the role of Supreme Court. 2. What elements of the working of judiciary and executive can you identify in it? 3. Identify the policy issues, matters related to legislation, implementation and interpretation of the law involved in this case. Center, Delhi join hands on CNG issue. By our staff reporter, The Hindu, the 23rd of September 2001. New Delhi, Sept. 22. The center and the Delhi government today agreed to jointly approach the Supreme Court this coming week for phasing out of all non-CNG commercial vehicles in the capital. They also decided to seek a dual-fuel policy for the city instead of putting the entire transportation system on the single-fuel mode, which was full of dangers and would result in disaster. It was also decided to discourage the use of CNG by private vehicle owners in the capital. Both governments would press for allowing the use of 0.05% low-sulfur diesel for running of buses in the capital. In addition, it would be pleaded before the court that all commercial vehicles, which fulfill the Euro 2 standards, should be allowed to ply in the city. Though both the center and the state would file separate affidavits, these would contain common points. The center would also go out and support the Delhi government's stand on the issues concerning CNG. These decisions were taken at a meeting between the Delhi Chief Minister, Ms. Sheila Dikshit, and the Union Petroleum and Natural Gas Minister, Mr. Aram Naik. Ms. Dikshit said the central government would request the court that in view of the high-powered committee appointed under Dr. A. Mashelkar to suggest an auto fuel policy for the entire country, it would be appropriate to extend the deadline as it was not possible to convert the entire 10,000-odd bus fleet into CNG during the prescribed time frame. The Mashelkar committee is expected to submit its report within a period of 6 months. The chief minister said time was required to implement the court directives. Referring to the coordinated approach on the issue, Ms. Dikshit said this would take into account the details about the number of vehicles to be run on CNG, eliminating long queues outside CNG filling stations, the CNG fuel requirements of Delhi and the ways and means to implement the directive of the court. The Supreme Court had refused to relax the only CNG norm for the city's buses but said it had never insisted on CNG for taxis and auto rickshaws. Mr. Naik said the center would insist on allowing use of low-sulfur diesel for buses in Delhi as putting the entire transportation system dependent on CNG could prove to be disastrous. The capital relied on pipeline supply for CNG and any disruption would throw the public transport system out of gear. 4. The following is a statement about Ecuador. What similarities or differences do you find between this example and the judicial system in India? It would be helpful if a body of common law, or judicial precedent, existed that could clarify a journalist's rights. Unfortunately, Ecuador's courts don't work that way. Judges are not forced to respect the rulings of higher courts in previous cases. Unlike the U.S., an appellate judge in Ecuador, or elsewhere in South America, for that matter, need not provide a written decision explaining the legal basis of a ruling. A judge may rule one way today and the opposite way, in a similar case, tomorrow, without explaining why. 7. Read the following statements, match them with the different jurisdictions the Supreme Court can exercise: original, appellate, and advisory. 1. The government wanted to know if it can pass a law about the citizenship status of residents of Pakistan-occupied areas of Jammu and Kashmir. 2. In order to resolve the dispute about River Kaveri, the government of Tamil Nadu wants to approach the court. 3. Court rejected the appeal by people against the eviction from the dam site. D. In what way can public interest litigation help the poor? Do you think that judicial activism can lead to a conflict between the judiciary and the executive? Why? 0. How is judicial activism related to the protection of fundamental rights? Has it helped in expanding the scope of fundamental rights? Chapter 7. Federalism. Introduction. Look at the political maps, on next 2 pages, of India 1947 and 2017. They have changed dramatically over the years. Boundaries of states have changed, names of states have changed, and the number of states has changed. When India became independent, we had a number of provinces that the British government had organized only for administrative convenience. Then a number of princely states merged with the newly independent Indian Union. These were joined to the existing provinces. This is what you see in the first map. Since then, boundaries of states have been reorganized many times. During this entire period, not only did boundaries of states change, but in some cases, even their names changed according to the wishes of the people of those states. Thus, Mysore changed to Karnataka and Madras became Tamil Nadu. The maps show these large-scale changes that have taken place in the span of over 70 years. In a way, these maps also tell us the story of functioning of federalism in India. After studying this chapter, you will be able to understand the following. 1. What is federalism? 2. The federal provisions in the Indian Constitution. 3. The issues involved in the relations between the center and the states, and 4. The special provisions for certain states having a distinct composition and historical features. What is federalism? USSR was one of the world's superpowers, but after 1989 it simply broke up into several independent countries. One of the major reasons for its breakup was the excessive centralization and concentration of power, and the domination of Russia over other regions with independent languages and cultures of their own, e.g. Uzbekistan. Some other countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Pakistan also had to face a division of the country. Canada came very close to a breakup between the English-speaking and the French-speaking regions of that country. Isn't it a great achievement that India, which emerged as an independent nation-state in 1947 after a painful partition, has remained united over 6 decades of its independent existence? What accounts for this achievement? Can we attribute it to the federal structure of governance that we in India adopted through our constitution? All the countries mentioned above were federations. Yet they could not remain united. Therefore, apart from adopting a federal constitution, the nature of that federal system and the practice of federalism must also be important factors. India is a land of continental proportions and immense diversities. There are more than 20 major languages and several hundred minor ones. It is the home of several major religions. There are several million indigenous peoples living in different parts of the country. In spite of all these diversities, we share a common land mass. We have also participated in a common history, especially when we fought for independence. We also share many other important features. This has led our national leaders to visualize India as a country where there is unity in diversity. Sometimes it is described as unity with diversity. Federalism does not consist of a set of fixed principles, which are applied to different historical situations. Rather, federalism as a principle of government has evolved differently in different situations. American federalism, one of the first major attempts to build a federal polity, is different from German or Indian federalism. But there are also a few key ideas and concepts associated with federalism. 1. Essentially, federalism is an institutional mechanism to accommodate 2 sets of polities, one at the regional level and the other at the national level. Each government is autonomous in its own sphere. In some federal countries, there is even a system of dual citizenship. India has only a single citizenship. 2. The people likewise have 2 sets of identities and loyalties. They belong to the region as well as the nation. For example, we are Gujaratis or Jharkhandis as well as Indians. Each level of the polity has distinct powers and responsibilities and has a separate system of government. 3. The details of this dual system of government are generally spelt out in a written constitution, which is considered to be supreme and which is also the source of the power of both sets of government. Certain subjects, which concern the nation as a whole, for example, defense or currency, are the responsibility of the union or central government. Regional or local matters are the responsibility of the regional or state government. 4. To prevent conflicts between the center and the state, there is an independent judiciary to settle disputes. The judiciary has the powers to resolve disputes between the central government and the states on legal matters about the division of power. Real politics, culture, ideology and history determine the actual working of a federation. A culture of trust, cooperation, mutual respect and restraint helps federations to function smoothly. Political parties also determine the way a constitution would work. If any single unit or state or linguistic group or ideology comes to dominate the entire federation, it could generate a deep resentment among people or its units not sharing the dominant voice. These situations could lead to demands for secession by the aggrieved units or could even result in civil wars. Many countries are embroiled in such conflict situations. Federalism in West Indies. You may have heard about the cricket team of West Indies. But is there a country called West Indies? Like India, West Indies was also colonized by the British. In 1958, the Federation of West Indies came into being. It had a weak central government and the economy of each unit was independent. These features and political competition among the units led to the formal dissolution of the Federation in 1962. Later, in 1973 by Treaty of Chigaramaz, the independent islands established joint authorities in the form of a common legislature, Supreme Court, a common currency, and, to a degree, a common market known as the Caribbean Community. The Caribbean Community has even a common executive, and heads of the governments of member countries are members of this executive. Thus, the units could neither live together as one country, nor can they live separately. Federalism in Nigeria. If the regions and various communities do not trust each other, even a federal arrangement can fail to produce unity. The example of Nigeria is instructive. Till 1914, northern and southern Nigeria were two separate British colonies. At the Ibadan Constitutional Conference of 1950, Nigerian leaders decided to form a federal constitution. The three major ethnic groups of Nigeria, Yoruba, Igbo and Hausa Fulani, controlled the regions of the west, the east and the north respectively. Their attempt to spread their influence to other regions led to fears and conflicts. These led to a military regime. In the 1960 constitution, both federal and regional governments jointly controlled the Nigerian police. In the military-supervised Constitution of 1979, no state was allowed to have any civil police. Though democracy was restored in Nigeria in 1999, religious differences along with conflicts over who will control revenues from the oil resources continue to present problems before the Nigerian Federation. Local ethnic communities resist centralized control of the oil resources. Thus, Nigeria is an example of overlap of religious, ethnic and economic differences among the units. Check your progress. 1. Who decides the powers of the central government in a federation? 2. How are conflicts between the central government and the states resolved in a federation? Federalism in the Indian Constitution. Even before independence, most leaders of our national movement were aware that to govern a large country like ours, it would be necessary to divide the powers between provinces and the central government. There was also awareness that Indian society had regional diversity and linguistic diversity. This diversity needed recognition. People of different regions and languages had to share power, and in each region, people of that region should govern themselves. This was only logical if we wanted a democratic government. The only question was what should be the extent of powers to be enjoyed by the regional governments. In view of the agitation of the Muslim League for greater representation to the Muslims, a compromise formula to give very large powers to the regions was discussed during the negotiations before partition. Once the decision to partition India was taken, the Constituent Assembly decided to frame a government that would be based on the principles of unity and cooperation between the center and the states and separate powers to the states. The most important feature of the federal system adopted by the Indian Constitution is the principle that relations between the states and the center would be based on cooperation. Thus, while recognizing diversity, the Constitution emphasized unity. Do you know, for example, that the Constitution of India does not even mention the word federation? This is how the Constitution describes India. Article 1, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. 2. The states and the territories thereof shall be as specified in the first schedule. Division of powers. There are two sets of government created by the Indian Constitution, one for the entire nation called the Union Government, Central Government, and one for each unit or state called the State Government. Both of these have a constitutional status and clearly identified area of activity. If there is any dispute about which powers come under the control of the Union and which under the states, this can be resolved by the judiciary on the basis of the constitutional provisions. The Constitution clearly demarcates subjects, which are under the exclusive domain of the Union and those under the states. Study the chart given on the next page carefully. It shows how powers are distributed between the center and the states. One of the important aspects of this division of powers is that economic and financial powers are centralized in the hands of the central government by the Constitution. The states have immense responsibilities but very meager revenue sources. Check your progress. 1. Do you think that there is a need for mentioning residuary powers separately? Why? 2. Why do the states feel dissatisfied about the division of powers? Constitution of India. Union list. Includes subjects like 1. Defense. 2. Atomic. 3. Energy. 4. Foreign. 5. Affairs. 6. War and peace. 7. Banking. 8. Railways. 9. Post and telegraph. 10. Airways. 11. Ports. 12. Foreign trade. 13. Currency and coinage. Union legislature alone can make laws on these matters. State list. Includes subjects like 1. Agriculture. 2. Police. 3. Prison. 4. Local. 5. Government. 6. Public heath. 7. Land. 8. Liquor. 9. Trade-in. 10. Commerce. 11. Livestock. 12. An animal. 13. Husbandry. 14. State public services. Normally only the state legislature can make laws on these matters. Concurrent. List includes subjects like 1. Education. 2. Transfer of property other than agricultural land. 3. Forests. 4. Trade unions. 5. Adulteration. 6. Adoption and succession. Both union and state legislature alone can make laws on these matters. Residuary powers include all other matters not mentioned in any of the lists. 1. Cyber laws. Union legislature alone has the power to legislate on such matters. Federalism with a strong central government. It is generally accepted that the Indian Constitution has created a strong central government. India is a country of continental dimensions with immense diversities and social problems. The framers of the Constitution believed that we required a federal constitution that would accommodate diversities. But they also wanted to create a strong center to stem disintegration and bring about social and political change. It was necessary for the center to have such powers because India at the time of independence was not only divided into provinces created by the British, but there were more than 500 princely states which had to be integrated into existing states or new states had to be created. Besides the concern for unity, the makers of the Constitution also believed that the socio-economic problems of the country needed to be handled by a strong central government in cooperation with the states. Poverty, illiteracy and inequalities of wealth were some of the problems that required planning and coordination. Thus, the concerns for unity and development prompted the makers of the Constitution to create a strong central government. Let us look at the important provisions that create a strong central government. 1. The very existence of a state, including its territorial integrity, is in the hands of Parliament. The Parliament is empowered to form a new state by separation of territory from any state or by uniting two or more states. It can also alter the boundary of any state or even its name. The Constitution provides for some safeguards by way of securing the view of the concerned state legislature. 2. The Constitution has certain very powerful emergency provisions, which can turn our federal polity into a highly centralized system once emergency is declared. During an emergency, power becomes lawfully centralized. Parliament also assumes the power to make laws on subjects within the jurisdiction of the states. 3. Even during normal circumstances, the central government has very effective financial powers and responsibilities. In the first place, items generating revenue are under the control of the central government. Thus, the central government has many revenue sources and the states are mostly dependent on the grants and financial assistance from the center. Secondly, India adopted planning as the instrument of rapid economic progress and development after independence. Planning led to considerable centralization of economic decision-making. Planning Commission appointed by the Union government is the coordinating machinery that controls and supervises the resources management of the states. Besides, the Union government uses its discretion to give grants and loans to states. This distribution of economic resources is considered lopsided and has led to charges of discrimination against states ruled by an opposition party. 4. As you will study later, the governor has certain powers to recommend dismissal of the state government and the dissolution of the assembly. Besides, even in normal circumstances, the governor has the power to reserve a bill passed by the state legislature, for the assent of the president. This gives the central government an opportunity to delay the state legislation and also to examine such bills and veto them completely. 5. There may be occasions when the situation may demand that the central government needs to legislate on matters from the state list. This is possible if the move is ratified by the Rajya Sabha. The Constitution clearly states that executive powers of the center are superior to the executive powers of the states. Furthermore, the central government may choose to give instructions to the state government. The following extract from an article of the Constitution makes this clear. You have already studied in the chapter on executive that we have an integrated administrative system. The All India services are common to the entire territory of India and officers chosen for these services serve in the administration of the states. Thus, an IAS officer who becomes the collector or an IPS officer who serves as the commissioner of police, are under the control of the central government. States can neither take disciplinary action nor can they remove these officers from service. Articles 33 and 34 authorize the Parliament to protect persons in the service of the Union or a state in respect of any action taken by them during martial law to maintain or restore order. This provisions further strengthens the powers of the Union government. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been made on the basis of these provisions. This act has created tensions between the people and the armed forces on some occasions. Article 257, 1. The executive power of every state shall be so exercised as not to impede or prejudice the exercise of the executive power of the Union, and the executive power of the Union shall extend to the giving of such directions to a state as may appear to the Government of India to be necessary for that purpose. Check your progress. 1. Give 2 reasons for the claim that our Constitution has a unitary bias. 2. Do you think that 0. A strong center makes the states weak? 1. Strong states will weaken the center. Conflicts in India's federal system. In the previous section, we have seen that the Constitution has vested very strong powers in the center. Thus, the Constitution recognizes the separate identity of the regions and yet gives more powers to the center. Once the principle of identity of the state is accepted, it is quite natural that the states would expect a greater role and powers in the governance of the state and the country as a whole. This leads to various demands from the states. From time to time, states have demanded that they should be given more powers and more autonomy. This leads to tensions and conflicts in the relations between the center and the states. While the legal disputes between the center and the states, or between states, can be resolved by the judiciary, demands for autonomy are of political nature and need to be resolved through negotiations. Center-state relations. The Constitution is only a framework or a skeleton, its flesh and blood is provided by the actual processes of politics. Hence federalism in India has to a large extent been influenced by the changing nature of the political process. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the foundation of our federalism was laid under Jawaharlal Nehru. It was also a period of Congress dominance over the center as well as the states. Except on the issue of formation of new states, the relations between the center and the states remained quite normal during this period. The states were hopeful that they would be making progress with the help of the grants and aid from the center. Besides, there was considerable optimism about the policies of socio-economic development designed by the center. In the middle of the 1960s, Congress dominance declined somewhat and in a large number of states opposition parties came to power. It resulted in demands for greater powers and greater autonomy to the states. In fact, these demands were a direct fallout of the fact that different parties were ruling at the center and in many states. So, the state governments were protesting against what they saw as unnecessary interference in their governments by the Congress government at the center. The Congress, too, was not very comfortable with the idea of dealing with governments led by opposition parties. This peculiar political context gave birth to a discussion about the concept of autonomy under a federal system. Finally, since the 1990s, Congress dominance has largely ended and we have entered an era of coalition politics, especially at the center. In the states too, different parties, both national and regional, have come to power. This has resulted in a greater say for the states, a respect for diversity and the beginning of a more mature federalism. Thus, it is in the second phase that the issue of autonomy became very potent politically. Demands for autonomy. Many states and even many political parties have, from time to time, demanded that states should have more autonomy vis-a-vis the central government. However, autonomy refers to different things for different states and parties. 1. Sometimes, these demands expect that the division of powers should be changed in favor of the states and more powers and important powers be assigned to the states. Many states, Tamil Nadu, Punjab, West Bengal, and many parties, DMK, Akali Dal, CPIM, have made demands of autonomy from time to time. 2. Another demand is that states should have independent sources of revenue and greater control over the resources. This is also known as financial autonomy. In 1977, the Left Front government in West Bengal brought out a document demanding a restructuring of center-state relations in India. In the autonomy demands of Tamil Nadu and Punjab also, there was an implicit support to the idea of greater financial powers. 3. The third aspect of the autonomy demands relates to administrative powers of the states. States resent the control of the center over the administrative machinery. 4. Fourthly, autonomy demands may also be related to cultural and linguistic issues. The opposition to the domination of Hindi, in Tamil Nadu, or demand for advancing the Punjabi language and culture are instances of this. Some states also feel that there is a domination of the Hindi-speaking areas over the others. In fact, during the decade of 1960s, there were agitations in some states against the imposition of the Hindi language. Role of governors and president's rule. The role of governors has always been a controversial issue between the states and the central government. The governor is not an elected officeholder. Many governors have been retired military officers or civil servants or politicians. Besides, the governor is appointed by the central government and therefore, actions of the governor are often viewed as interference by the central government in the functioning of the state government. When two different parties are in power at the center and the state, the role of the governor becomes even more controversial. The Sarkaria Commission that was appointed by the central government, 1983, it submitted its report in 1988 to examine the issues relating to center-state relations, recommended that appointments of governors should be strictly nonpartisan. Powers and role of the governor become controversial for one more reason. One of the most controversial articles in the Constitution is Article 356, which provides for president's rule in any state. This provision is to be applied when a situation has arisen in which the government of the state cannot be carried on in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution. It results in the takeover of the state government by the Union government. The President's proclamation has to be ratified by Parliament. President's rule can be extended till 3 years. The governor has the power to recommend the dismissal of the state government and suspension or dissolution of state assembly. This has led to many conflicts. In some cases, state governments were dismissed even when they had a majority in the legislature, as had happened in Kerala in 1959, or without testing their majority, as happened in several other states after 1967. Some cases went to the Supreme Court, and the court has ruled that constitutional validity of the decision to impose president's rule can be examined by the judiciary. Article 356 was very sparingly used till 1967. After 1967, many states had non-Congress governments and the Congress was in power at the center. The center has often used this provision to dismiss state governments, or has used the office of the governor to prevent the majority party or coalition from assuming office. For instance, the central government removed elected governments in Andhra Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir in the decade of 1980s. Demands for new states. The other dimension of tension in our federal system has been the demand to create new states. The national movement not only created a pan-Indian national unity, it also generated distinct unity around a common language, region and culture. Our national movement was also a movement for democracy. Therefore, in the course of the national movement itself, it was decided that as far as possible, states would be created on the basis of common cultural and linguistic identity. This ultimately led to the demand for the creation of linguistic states after independence. In December 1953, the States Reorganization Commission was set up, and it recommended the creation of linguistic states, at least for the major linguistic groups. In 1956, reorganization of some states took place. This saw the beginning of the creation of linguistic states, and the process is still continuing. Gujarat and Maharashtra were created in 1960, Punjab and Haryana were separated from each other in 1966. Later, the northeastern region was reorganized and new states like Manipur, Tripura, Meghalaya, Mizoram and Arunachal Pradesh were created. In 2000, some of the larger states were further divided, both to meet the demands for a separate state as well as to meet the need for greater administrative efficiency. Thus Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar were divided to create 3 new states. They are Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand and Jharkhand respectively. Some regions and linguistic groups are still struggling for separate statehood, like Vidarbha in Maharashtra. Interstate conflicts. While the states keep fighting with the center over autonomy and other issues like the share in revenue resources, there have been many instances of disputes between 2 states or among more than 2 states. It is true that the judiciary acts as the arbitration mechanism on disputes of a legal nature, but these disputes are in reality not just legal. They have political implications, and therefore they can best be resolved only through negotiations and mutual understanding. Broadly, 2 types of disputes keep recurring. One is the border dispute. States have certain claims over territories belonging to neighboring states. Though language is the basis of defining boundaries of the states, often border areas would have populations speaking more than one language. So, it is not easy to resolve this dispute merely on the basis of linguistic majority. One of the long-standing border disputes is the dispute between Maharashtra and Karnataka over the city of Belgaum. Manipur and Nagaland, too, have a long-standing border dispute. The carving out of Haryana from the erstwhile state of Punjab has led to dispute between the 2 states not only over border areas, but over the capital city of Chandigarh. This city today houses the capital of both these states. In 1985, the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi reached an understanding with the leadership of Punjab. According to this understanding, Chandigarh was to be handed over to Punjab. But this has not happened yet. While border disputes are more about sentiment, the disputes over the sharing of river waters are even more serious, because they are related to problems of drinking water and agriculture in the concerned states. You might have heard about the Kaveri water dispute. This is a major issue between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Farmers in both the states are dependent on Kaveri waters. Though there is a river water tribunal to settle water disputes, this dispute has reached the Supreme Court. In another similar dispute, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra are battling over sharing the waters of Narmada River. Rivers are a major resource and therefore, disputes over river waters test the patience and cooperative spirit of the states. Activity. Collect information about at least one dispute about river waters involving 2 or more states. Check your progress. 1. Why do states want more autonomy? 2. What is the difference between autonomy and secession? Special provisions. The most extraordinary feature of the federal arrangement created in India is that many states get a differential treatment. We have already noted in the chapter on legislature that the size and population of each state being different, an asymmetrical representation is provided in the Rajya Sabha. While ensuring minimum representation to each of the smaller states, this arrangement also ensures that larger states would get more representation. In the case of division of powers, too, the Constitution provides a division of powers that is common to all the states. And yet, the Constitution has some special provisions for some states given their peculiar social and historical circumstances. Most of the special provisions pertain to the northeastern states, Assam, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, etc. Largely due to a sizable indigenous tribal population with a distinct history and culture, which they wish to retain, Art. 371. However, these provisions have not been able to stem alienation and the insurgency in parts of the region. Special provisions also exist for hilly states like Himachal Pradesh and some other states like Andhra Pradesh, Goa, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Sikkim and Telangana. Jammu and Kashmir. The other state which has a special status is Jammu and Kashmir, J&K, Art. 370. Jammu and Kashmir was one of the large princely states, which had the option of joining India or Pakistan at the time of independence. Immediately after independence, Pakistan and India fought a war over Kashmir. Under such circumstances, the Maharaja of Kashmir acceded to the Indian Union. Most of the Muslim-majority states joined Pakistan, but J&K was an exception. Under these circumstances, it was given much greater autonomy by the Constitution. According to Article 370, the concurrence of the state is required for making any laws in matters mentioned in the Union and concurrent lists. This is different from the position of other states. In the case of other states, the division of powers as listed through the 3 lists automatically applies. In the case of Jammu and Kashmir, the central government has only limited powers and other powers listed in the Union list and concurrent list can be used only with the consent of the state government. This gives the state of Jammu and Kashmir greater autonomy. In practice, however, the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir is much less than what the language of Article 370 may suggest. There is a constitutional provision that allows the President, with the concurrence of the state government, to specify which parts of the Union list shall apply to the state. The President has issued 2 constitutional orders in concurrence with the government of J&K, making large parts of the Constitution applicable to the state. As a result, though J&K has a separate constitution and a flag, the Parliament's power to make laws on subjects in the Union list now is fully accepted. The remaining differences between the other states and the state of J&K are that no emergency due to internal disturbances can be declared in J&K without the concurrence of the state. The Union government cannot impose a financial emergency in the state and the directive principles do not apply in J&K. Finally, amendments to the Indian Constitution, under Art. 368 can only apply in concurrence with the government of J&K. Many people believe that a formal and strictly equal division of powers applicable to all units, states, of a federation is adequate. Therefore, whenever such special provisions are created, there is some opposition to them. There is also a fear that such special provisions may lead to separatism in those areas. Therefore, there are controversies about such special provisions. Constituent Assembly debates. Let me tell my honorable friends in the House that the drift, in all constitutions, has been towards the center. Because of circumstances that have now come into being, that the states have become federal or unitary welfare states from being police states, and the ultimate responsibility is for the economic well-being of the country has become the paramount responsibility of the center. Krishnamachari, CAD, Volume 11, p. 955 to 956, the 25th of November 1949. Conclusion. Federalism is like a rainbow, where each color is separate, yet together they make a harmonious pattern. Federalism has to continuously maintain a difficult balance between the center and the states. No legal or institutional formula can guarantee the smooth functioning of a federal polity. Ultimately, the people in the political process must develop a culture and a set of values and virtues like mutual trust, toleration, and a spirit of cooperation. Federalism celebrates both unity as well as diversity. National unity cannot be built by streamlining differences. Such forced unity only generates greater social strife and alienation and tends finally to destroy unity. A responsive polity sensitive to diversities and to the demands for autonomy can alone be the basis of a cooperative federation. Exercises. 1. From the list of following events, which ones would you identify with the functioning of federalism? Why? At the center on Tuesday announced 6th schedule status to GNLF-led Darjeeling Gorkha Hill Council, which would ensure greater autonomy to the governing body in the Hill district of West Bengal. A tripartite memorandum of settlement was signed in New Delhi between the Centre, West Bengal government and the Subhas Ghai-led Gorkha National Liberation Front (GNLF), after 2 days of hectic deliberations. B. Government for Action Plan for Rain-Hit States. Centre has asked the rain-ravaged states to submit detailed plans for reconstruction to enable it to respond to their demands for extra relief expeditiously. C. New Commissioner for Delhi. The capital is getting a new Municipal Commissioner. Confirming this, present MCD Commissioner Rakesh Mehta said he has received his transfer orders and that he is likely to be replaced by IAS officer Ashok Kumar, who is serving as the Chief Secretary in Arunachal Pradesh. Mehta, a 1975 batch IAS officer, has been heading the MCD for about 3.5 years. Square root CU status for Manipur University. Rajya Sabha on Wednesday passed a bill to convert the Manipur University into a central university, with the Human Resource Development Minister promising such institutions in the northeastern states of Arunachal Pradesh, Tripura and Sikkim as well. 0. Funds released. The center has released Rs. 553 lakh to Arunachal Pradesh under its Rural Water Supply Scheme. The first installment was of Rs. 466.81 lakh. 1. We'll teach the Biharis how to live in Mumbai. Around 100 Shiv Sainik stormed J. Hospital, disrupted daily operations, raised slogans and threatened to take matters into their own hands if no action was taken against non-Maharashtrian students. 2. Demand for dismissal of government. The Congress Legislature Party (CLP), in a representation submitted to State Governor recently, has demanded dismissal of the ruling Democratic Alliance of Nagaland (DAN) government for its alleged financial mismanagement and embezzlement of public money. 3. NDA government asks Naxalites to surrender arms, amid a walkout by opposition RJD and its allies Congress and CPI-M. The Bihar government today appealed to the Naxalites to shun the path of violence and reaffirmed its pledge to root out unemployment to usher in a new era of development in Bihar. Think which of the following statements would be correct. State why. 0. Federalism enhances the possibility of people from different regions to interact without the fear of one's culture being imposed upon them by others. 1. Federal system will hinder easier economic transaction between two different regions that have distinct types of resources. 2. A federal system will ensure that the powers of those at the center will remain limited. Based on the first few articles of Belgian constitution, given below. Explain how federalism is visualized in that country. Try and write a similar article for the Constitution of India. Title I, on Federal Belgium, its components and its territory. Article 1, Belgium is a federal state made up of communities and regions. Article 2, Belgium is made up of three communities, the French community, the Flemish community and the German community. Article 3, Belgium is made up of three regions, the Walloon region, the Flemish region and the Brussels region. Article 4, Belgium has four linguistic regions, the French-speaking region, the Dutch-speaking region, the bilingual region of Brussels capital and the German-speaking region. Each commune, county borough, of the kingdom is part of one of these linguistic regions. Article 5, the Walloon region is made up of the following provinces, the Walloon Brabant, Hainaut, Liege, Luxembourg and Namur. The Flemish region is made up of the following provinces, Antwerp, the Flemish Brabant, West Flanders, East Flanders and Limburg. 4. Imagine that you were to rewrite the provisions regarding federalism. Write an essay of not more than 300 words making your suggestions about A. Division of powers among the center and the states. B. Distribution of financial resources. C. Methods of resolving interstate disputes and D. Appointment of governors. 5. Which of the following should be the basis for formation of a state? Y. A. Common language. B. Common economic interests. C. Common religion. D. Administrative convenience. 6. Majority of people from the states of North India, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, speak Hindi. If all these states are combined to form one state, would it be in tune with the idea of federalism? Give arguments. 7. List 4 features of the Indian Constitution that give greater power to the central government than the state government. 8. Why are many states unhappy about the role of the governor? 9. President's rule can be imposed in a state if the government is not being run according to the provisions of the Constitution. State whether any of the following conditions are a fit case for imposition of president's rule in the state. Give reasons. 0. 2 members of the state legislative assembly belonging to the main opposition party have been killed by criminals and the opposition is demanding dismissal of the state government. 1. Kidnapping of young children for ransom is on rise. The number of crimes against women are increasing. 2. No political party has secured majority in the recent elections of the state legislative assembly. It is feared that some MLAs from the other parties may be lured to support a political party in return for money. 3. Different political parties are ruling in the state and at the center and they are bitter opponents of each other. 4. More than 2,000 people have been killed in the communal riots. 5. In the water dispute between the two states, one state government refused to follow the decision of the Supreme Court. 4. What are the demands raised by states in their quest for greater autonomy? 5. Should some states be governed by special provisions? Does this create resentment among other states? Does this help in forging greater unity among the regions of the country? Chapter 8. Local governments. Introduction. In a democracy, it is not sufficient to have an elected government at the center and at the state level. It is also necessary that even at the local level, there should be an elected government to look after local affairs. In this chapter, you will study the structure of local government in our country. You will also study the importance of the local governments and ways to give them independent powers. After studying this chapter, you will know 1. The importance of local government bodies. 2. The provisions made by the 73rd and 74th Amendments, and 3. Functions and responsibilities of the local government bodies. Why local governments? Geeta Rathore belongs to Jamunia Talab Gram Panchayat, Sehor district, Madhya Pradesh. She was elected Sarpanch in 1995 from a reserved seat, but in 2000, the village people rewarded her for her admirable work by electing her again, this time from a non-reserved seat. From a housewife, Geeta has grown into a leader displaying political farsightedness. She has harnessed the collective energy of her panchayat to renovate water tanks, build a school building, construct village roads, fight against domestic violence and atrocities against women, create environmental awareness, and encourage afforestation and water management in her village. Panchayati Raj Update, Volume 11, Number 3, February 2004. There is another story of yet another woman achiever. She was the president, Sarpanch, of a Gram Panchayat of Vengavasal village in Tamil Nadu. In 1997, the Tamil Nadu government allotted 2 hectares of land to 71 government employees. This piece of land fell within the vicinity of this Gram Panchayat. On the instructions of higher authorities, the district collector of Kanchipuram directed the president of the Gram Panchayat to pass a resolution endorsing the allotment of the said land for the purpose already decided. The president and the Gram Panchayat refused to pass such an order, and the collector issued an order to acquire the land. The Gram Panchayat filed a writ petition in the Madras High Court against the collector's action. The single-judge bench of the High Court upheld the collector's order and ruled that there was no need to take the panchayat's consent. The panchayat appealed to the division bench against the single judge's order. In its order, the division bench reversed the order of the single judge. The judges held that the government order amounted to not only infringement of the powers of the panchayats but a gross violation of the constitutional status of the panchayats. Panchayati Raj Update, Volume 12, June 2005. Both these stories are not isolated incidents. They are representative of a larger transformation that is taking place across India, especially after constitutional status was accorded to local government institutions in 1993. Local government is government at the village and district level. Local government is about government closest to the common people. Local government is about government that involves the day-to-day life and problems of ordinary citizens. Local government believes that local knowledge and local interest are essential ingredients for democratic decision-making. They are also necessary for efficient and people-friendly administration. The advantage of local government is that it is so near the people. It is convenient for the people to approach the local government for solving their problems both quickly and with minimum cost. In the story of Geeta Rathore, we noticed that she was able to bring about a significant change in Jamunia Talab because of her proactive role as Sarpanch of the Gram Panchayat. Vengavasal village is able to still retain its land and the right to decide what to do with it because of the relentless efforts of its Gram Panchayat president and members. So, local governments can be very effective in protecting the local interests of the people. Democracy is about meaningful participation. It is also about accountability. Strong and vibrant local governments ensure both active participation and purposeful accountability. Geeta Rathore's story is one of committed participation. Vengavasal village Gram Panchayat's relentless efforts to secure its rights over its own land were an example of a mission to ensure accountability. It is at the level of local government that common citizens can be involved in decision-making concerning their lives, their needs and above all their development. It is necessary that in a democracy, tasks, which can be performed locally, should be left in the hands of the local people and their representatives. Common people are more familiar with their local government than with the government at the state or national level. They are also more concerned with what local government does or has failed to do, as it has a direct bearing and impact on their day-to-day life. Thus, strengthening local government is like strengthening democratic processes. Check your progress. 1. How does local government strengthen democracy? 2. In the example given above, what do you think the government of Tamil Nadu should have done? Growth of local government in India. Let us now discuss how local government has grown in India and what our constitution says about it. It is believed that self-governing village communities existed in India from the earliest times in the form of sabhas, village assemblies. In the course of time, these village bodies took the shape of panchayats, an assembly of 5 persons, and these panchayats resolved issues at the village level. Their role and functions kept on changing at different points of time. In modern times, elected local government bodies were created after 1882. Lord Ripon, who was the Viceroy of India at that time, took the initiative in creating these bodies. They were called the local boards. However, due to slow progress in this regard, the Indian National Congress urged the government to take necessary steps to make all local bodies more effective. Following the Government of India Act 1919, village panchayats were established in a number of provinces. This trend continued after the Government of India Act of 1935. During India's freedom movement, Mahatma Gandhi had strongly pleaded for decentralization of economic and political power. He believed that strengthening village panchayats was a means of effective decentralization. All development initiatives must have local involvement in order to be successful. Panchayats therefore were looked upon as instruments of decentralization and participatory democracy. Our national movement was concerned about the enormous concentration of powers in the hands of the Governor-General sitting at Delhi. Therefore, for our leaders, independence meant an assurance that there will be decentralization of decision-making, executive and administrative powers. When the Constitution was prepared, the subject of local government was assigned to the states. It was also mentioned in the Directive Principles as one of the policy directives to all governments in the country. As you have read in Chapter 2, being a part of the Directive Principles of State Policy, this provision of the Constitution was non-justiciable and primarily advisory in its nature. It is felt that the subject of local government including panchayats did not receive adequate importance in the Constitution. Do you know why this happened? A few reasons can be advanced here. Firstly, the turmoil due to the partition resulted in a strong unitary inclination in the Constitution. Nehru himself looked upon extreme localism as a threat to unity and integration of the nation. Secondly, there was a powerful voice in the Constituent Assembly led by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar which felt that the faction and caste-ridden nature of rural society would defeat the noble purpose of local government at the rural level. However, nobody denied the importance of people's participation in development planning. Many members of the Constituent Assembly wanted village panchayats to be the basis of democracy in India, but they were concerned about factionalism and many other ills present in the villages. Local governments in independent India. Local governments got a fillip after the 73rd and 74th Constitution Amendment Acts. But even before that, some efforts in the direction of developing local government bodies had already taken place. First in the line was the Community Development Program in 1952, which sought to promote people's participation in local development in a range of activities. In this background, a three-tier Panchayati Raj system of local government was recommended for the rural areas. Some states, like Gujarat, Maharashtra, adopted the system of elected local bodies around 1960. But in many states those local bodies did not have enough powers and functions to look after the local development. They were very much dependent on the state and central governments for financial assistance. Many states did not think it necessary to establish elected local bodies. In many instances, local bodies were dissolved and the local government was handed over to government officers. Many states had indirect elections to most local bodies. In many states, elections to the local bodies were postponed from time to time. After 1987, a thorough review of the functioning of local government institutions was initiated. In 1989, the P.K. Thungan Committee recommended constitutional recognition for the local government bodies. A constitutional amendment to provide for periodic elections to local government institutions, and enlistment of appropriate functions to them, along with funds, was recommended. Check your progress. 1. Both Nehru and Dr. Ambedkar were not very enthusiastic about local government bodies. Did they have similar objections to local governments? 2. What was the constitutional provision about local governments before 1992? 3. Which were the states that had established local government during the 1960s and 1970s? 73rd and 74th Amendments. In 1989, the central government introduced 2 constitutional amendments. These amendments aimed at strengthening local governments and ensuring an element of uniformity in their structure and functioning across the country. The Constitution of Brazil has created states, federal districts and municipal councils. Each of these is assigned independent powers and jurisdiction. Just as the Republic cannot interfere in the affairs of the states, except on grounds provided by the Constitution, states are prohibited from interfering in the affairs of the municipal councils. This provision protects the powers of the local government. Later in 1992, the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments were passed by the Parliament. The 73rd Amendment is about rural local governments, which are also known as Panchayati Raj institutions or PRI, and the 74th Amendment made the provisions relating to urban local government, Nagarpalikas. The 73rd and 74th Amendments came into force in 1993. We have noticed earlier that local government is a state subject. States are free to make their own laws on this subject. But once the Constitution was amended, the states had to change their laws about local bodies in order to bring these in conformity with the amended Constitution. They were given 1 year's time for making necessary changes in their respective state laws in the light of these amendments. 73rd Amendment. Let us now examine the changes brought about by the 73rd Amendment in Panchayati Raj institutions. 3-tier structure. All states now have a uniform 3-tier Panchayati Raj structure. At the base is the Gram Panchayat. A Gram Panchayat covers a village or group of villages. The intermediary level is the Mandal, also referred to as block or taluka. These bodies are called Mandal or taluka Panchayats. The intermediary level body need not be constituted in smaller states. At the apex is the Zilla Panchayat covering the entire rural area of the district. The amendment also made a provision for the mandatory creation of the Gram Sabha. The Gram Sabha would comprise all the adult members registered as voters in the Panchayat area. Its role and functions are decided by state legislation. Elections. All the 3 levels of Panchayati Raj institutions are elected directly by the people. The term of each Panchayat body is 5 years. If the state government dissolves the Panchayat before the end of its 5-year term, fresh elections must be held within 6 months of such dissolution. This is an important provision that ensures the existence of elected local bodies. Before the 73rd Amendment, in many states, there used to be indirect elections to the district bodies and there was no provision for immediate elections after dissolution. Reservations. 1/3 of the positions in all Panchayat institutions are reserved for women. Reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are also provided for at all the 3 levels, in proportion to their population. If the states find it necessary, they can also provide for reservations for the other backward classes, OBCs. It is important to note that these reservations apply not merely to ordinary members in panchayats but also to the positions of chairpersons or adhyakshas at all the 3 levels. Further, reservation of 1/3 of the seats for women is not merely in the general category of seats but also within the seats reserved for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and backward castes. This means that a seat may be reserved simultaneously for a woman candidate and one belonging to the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes. Thus, a sarpanch would have to be a Dalit woman or an Adivasi woman. Transfer of subjects. 29 subjects, which were earlier in the state list of subjects, are identified and listed in the 11th schedule of the Constitution. These subjects are to be transferred to the Panchayati Raj institutions. These subjects were mostly linked to development and welfare functions at the local level. The actual transfer of these functions depends upon the state legislation. Each state decides how many of these 29 subjects would be transferred to the local bodies. The provisions of the 73rd Amendment were not made applicable to the areas inhabited by the Adivasi populations in many states of India. In 1996, a separate act was passed extending the provisions of the panchayat system to these areas. Many Adivasi communities have their traditional customs of managing common resources such as forests and small water reservoirs, etc. Therefore, the new act protects the rights of these communities to manage their resources in ways acceptable to them. For this purpose, more powers are given to the Gram Sabhas of these areas, and elected village panchayats have to get the consent of the Gram Sabha in many respects. The idea behind this act is that local traditions of self-government should be protected while introducing modern elected bodies. This is only consistent with the spirit of diversity and decentralization. Article 243G. Powers, authority and responsibilities of panchayats. The legislature of a state may, by law, endow the panchayats with such powers and authority. With respect to the matters listed in the 11th schedule. Some subjects listed in the 11th schedule. 1. Agriculture. 3. Minor irrigation, water management and watershed development. 8. Small-scale industries, including food processing industries. 10. Rural housing. 11. Drinking water. 13. Roads, culverts. 14. Rural electrification. 16. Poverty alleviation program. 17. Education, including primary and secondary schools. 18. Technical training and vocational education. 19. Adult and non-formal education. 20. Libraries. 21. Cultural activities. 22. Markets and fairs. 23. Health and sanitation, including hospitals, primary health centers and dispensaries. 24. Family welfare. 25. Women and child development. 26. Social welfare. 27. Welfare of the weaker sections, and in particular, of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. 28. Public distribution system. State election commissioners. The state government is required to appoint a state election commissioner who would be responsible for conducting elections to the Panchayati Raj institutions. Earlier, this task was performed by the state administration, which was under the control of the state government. Now, the office of the State Election Commissioner is autonomous like the Election Commissioner of India. However, the State Election Commissioner is an independent officer and is not linked to, nor is this officer under the control of the Election Commission of India. State Finance Commission. The state government is also required to appoint a State Finance Commission once in 5 years. This commission would examine the financial position of the local governments in the state. It would also review the distribution of revenues between the state and local governments on the one hand and between rural and urban local governments on the other. This innovation ensures that allocation of funds to the rural local governments will not be a political matter. Activity 1. Identify some of the powers that your state government has delegated to panchayats. 74th Amendment. As we mentioned earlier, the 74th Amendment dealt with urban local bodies or nagarpalikas. What is an urban area? It is very easy to identify a big city like Mumbai or Kolkata, but it is not so easy to say this about some very small urban areas that are somewhere between a village and a town. The Census of India defines an urban area as having a minimum population of 5,000, at least 75% of male working population engaged in non-agricultural occupations, and a density of population of at least 400 persons per square km. As per the 2011 census, about 31% of India's population lives in urban areas. In many ways, the 74th Amendment is a repetition of the 73rd Amendment, except that it applies to urban areas. All the provisions of the 73rd Amendment relating to direct elections, reservations, transfer of subjects, State Election Commission and State Finance Commission are incorporated in the 74th Amendment also and thus apply to nagarpalikas. The Constitution also mandated the transfer of a list of functions from the state government to the urban local bodies. These functions have been listed in the 12th schedule of the Constitution. Implementation of 73rd and 74th Amendments. All states have now passed a legislation to implement the provisions of the 73rd and 74th Amendments. During the 10 years since these amendments came into force, 1994-2004, most states have had at least 2 rounds of elections to the local bodies. States like Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and a few others have in fact held 3 elections so far. Today there are more than 600 Zilla Panchayats, about 6,000 block or intermediary panchayats, and 40,000 gram panchayats in rural India and over 100 city corporations, 1,400 town municipalities and over 2,000 Nagar panchayats in urban India. More than 32 lakh members are elected to these bodies every 5 years. Of these, at least 13 lakhs are women. In the state assemblies and parliament put together we have less than 5,000 elected representatives. With local bodies, the number of elected representatives has increased significantly. The 73 RD and 74 TH amendments have created uniformity in the structures of Panchayati Raj and Nagarpalika institutions across the country. The presence of these local institutions is by itself a significant achievement and would create an atmosphere and platform for people's participation in government. The provision for reservation for women at the panchayats and nagarpalikas has ensured the presence of a significant number of women in local bodies. As this reservation is also applicable for the positions of sarpanch and adhyaksha, a large number of women elected representatives have come to occupy these positions. There are at least 200 women adhyakshas in Zilla Panchayats, another 2,000 women who are presidents of the block or taluka panchayats and more than 80,000 women sarpanchas in gram panchayats. We also have more than 30 women mayors in corporations, over 500 women adhyakshas of town municipalities and nearly 650 Nagar panchayats headed by women. Women have gained more power and confidence by asserting control over resources. Their presence in these institutions has given many women a greater understanding of the working of politics. In many cases, they have brought a new perspective and a greater sensitivity to discussions at local bodies. In many cases, women were unable to assert their presence or were mere proxies for the male members of their family who sponsored their election. Such instances, however, are becoming fewer. While reservations for scheduled castes and tribes are mandated by the constitutional amendment, most states have also made a provision to reserve seats for backward castes. As the Indian population has 16.2% scheduled castes and 8.2% scheduled tribes, about 6.6 lakh elected members in the urban and local bodies hail from these two communities. This has significantly altered the social profile of local bodies. These bodies have thus become more representative of the social reality they operate within. Sometimes this leads to tensions. The dominant social groups which controlled the village earlier do not wish to give up their power. This leads to intensification of struggle for power. But tension and struggle is not always bad. Whenever there is an attempt to make democracy more meaningful and give power to those who did not enjoy it earlier, there is bound to be some conflict and tension in society. The constitutional amendments assigned as many as 29 subjects to the local governments. All these subjects are related to functions linked to local welfare and development needs. The experience with the functioning of local government in the past decade has shown that local governments in India enjoy limited autonomy to perform the functions assigned to them. Many states have not transferred most of the subjects to the local bodies. This means that the local bodies cannot really function in an effective manner. Therefore, the entire exercise of electing so many representatives becomes somewhat symbolic. Some people criticize the formation of the local bodies because this has not changed the way in which decisions are taken at the central and the state level. People at the local level do not enjoy much powers of choosing welfare programs or allocation of resources. Local bodies have very little funds of their own. The dependence of local bodies on the state and central governments for financial support has greatly eroded their capacity to operate effectively. While rural local bodies raise 0.24% of the total revenues collected, they account for 4% of the total expenditure made by the government. So they earn much less than they spend. That makes them dependent on those who give them grants. Local government in Bolivia. Bolivia is frequently cited as one of the most successful cases of democratic decentralization in Latin America. In 1994, the Popular Participation Law decentralized power to the local level, allowing for the popular election of mayors, dividing the country into municipalities, and crafting a system of automatic fiscal transfers to the new municipalities. Bolivia is divided into 314 municipal governments. These governments in Bolivia are headed by popularly elected mayors, Presidente Municipal, and a municipal council, Cabildo. Local elections occur nationwide every 5 years. Bolivian local governments have been entrusted with building local health and education facilities, as well as maintenance of this infrastructure. In Bolivia, 20% of nationwide tax collections are distributed among municipalities on a per capita basis. While these municipalities may levy taxes on motor vehicles, urban property, and large agricultural properties, fiscal transfers provide the bulk of the operating budget for these units. Quotes. The independence of India should mean the independence of the whole of India. Independence must begin at the bottom. Thus every village will be a republic. It follows therefore that every village has to be self-sustained and capable of managing its affairs. In this structure composed of innumerable villages, there will be ever-widening, ever-ascending circles. Life will be a pyramid with the apex sustained by the bottom. Mahatma Gandhi. Constituent Assembly debates. 1. In the interests of democracy, the villages may be trained in the art of self-government, even autonomy. We must be able to reform the villages and introduce democratic principles of government there. Ananthasayana Mayangar, CAD, Volume 7, p. 428, the 17th of November 1948. Conclusion. This experience suggests that local governments continue to be agencies implementing the welfare and development schemes of the central and state government. Giving more power to local government means that we should be prepared for real decentralization of power. Ultimately, democracy means that power should be shared by the people. People in the villages and urban localities must have the power to decide what policies and programs they want to adopt. As you have studied earlier, democracy means decentralization of power and giving more and more power to the people. The laws about local governments are an important step in the direction of democratization. But the true test of democracy is not merely in the legal provisions but in the practice of those provisions. Exercises. 2. Constitution of India visualized village panchayats as units of self-government. Think over the situation described in the following statements and explain how do these situations strengthen or weaken the panchayats in becoming units of self-government. A government of a state has allowed a big company to establish a huge steel plant. Many villages would be adversely affected by the steel plant. Gram Sabha of one of the affected villages passed a resolution that before establishing any big industries in the region, village people must be consulted and their grievances should be redressed. B. The government has decided that 20% of all its expenditure would be done through the panchayats. C. A village panchayat kept on demanding funds for a building for village school. The government officials turned down their proposal saying that funds are allocated for certain other schemes and cannot be spent otherwise. D. The government divided a village Dungarpur into two and made a part of village Jamuna and Sohana. Now village Dungarpur has ceased to exist in government's books. E. A village panchayat observed that water sources of their region are depleting fast. They decided to mobilize village youth to do some voluntary work and revive the old village ponds and wells. 3. Suppose you are entrusted to evolve a local government plan of a state, what powers would you endow to the village panchayats to function as units of self-government? Mention any 5 powers and the justification in 2 lines for each of them for giving those powers. 4. What are the provisions for the reservations for the socially disadvantaged groups as per the 73rd Amendment? Explain how these provisions have changed the profile of the leadership at the village level. 5. What were the main differences between the local governments before 73rd Amendment and after that amendment? 6. Read the following conversation. Write in 200 words your opinion about the issues raised in this conversation. Alec, our Constitution guarantees equality between men and women. Reservations in local bodies for women ensure their equal share in power. Neha, but it is not enough that women should be in positions of power. It is necessary that the budget of local bodies should have separate provision for women. Jayesh, I don't like this reservations business. A local body must take care of all people in the village, and that would automatically take care of women and their interests. 7. Read the provisions of the 73rd Amendment. Which of the following concerns does this amendment address? 1. Fear of replacement makes representatives accountable to the people. 2. The dominant castes and feudal landlords dominate the local bodies. 3. Rural illiteracy is very high. Illiterate people cannot take decisions about the development of the village. 4. To be effective, the village panchayats need resources and powers to make plans for the village development. 8. The following are different justifications given in favor of local government. Give them ranking and explain why you attach greater significance to a particular rationale than the others. According to you, on which of these rationales the decision of the Gram Panchayat of Ngavasal village was based? How? 1. Government can complete the projects with lesser cost with the involvement of the local community. 2. The development plans made by the local people will have greater acceptability than those made by the government officers. 3. People know their area, needs, problems, and priorities. By collective participation, they should discuss and take decisions about their life. 4. It is difficult for the common people to contact their representatives of the state or the national legislature. 9. Which of the following according to you involve decentralization? Why are other options not sufficient for decentralization? 5. To hold election of the Gram Panchayat. 6. Decision by the villagers themselves about what policies and programs are useful for the village. C. Power to call meeting of Gram Sabha. D. A Gram Panchayat receiving the report from the block development officer about the progress of a project started by the state government. 10. A student of Delhi University, Raghavendra Parpana, wanted to study the role of decentralization in decision-making about primary education. He asked some questions to the villagers. These questions are given below. If you were among those villagers, what answer would you give to each of these questions? A meeting of the Gram Sabha is to be called to discuss what steps should be taken to ensure that every child of the village goes to the school. 1. How would you decide the suitable day for the meeting? Think who would be able to attend, not attend the meeting because of your choice. 1. A day specified by the BDO or the collector. 2. Day of the village hot. 3. Sunday. 4. Nag Panchami, Sankranti. 2. What is a suitable venue for the meeting? Why? 1. Venue suggested by the circular of the district collector. 2. Religious place in the village. 3. Dalit Mohalla. 4. Upper caste Tola. 5. Village school. 3. In the Gram Sabha meeting, firstly a circular sent by the district collector was read. It suggested what steps should be taken to organize an education rally and what should be its route. The meeting did not discuss about the children who never come to school or about girls' education, or the condition of the school building and the timing of the school. No women teacher attended the meeting as it was held on Sunday. What do you think about these proceedings as an instance of people's participation? 4. Imagine your class is the Gram Sabha. Discuss the agenda of the meeting and suggest some steps to realize the goal. Chapter 9. Constitution is a living document. Introduction. In this chapter, you will see how the Constitution has worked in the last 69 years and how India has managed to be governed by the same Constitution. After studying this chapter, you will find out that 1. The Indian Constitution can be amended according to the needs of the time. 2. Though many such amendments have already taken place, the Constitution has remained intact and its basic premises have not changed. 3. The judiciary has played an important role in protecting the Constitution and 4. Also in interpreting the Constitution, and 5. The Constitution is a document that keeps evolving and responding to changing situations. Are constitutions static? It is not uncommon for nations to rewrite their constitutions in response to changed circumstances or change of ideas within the society or even due to political upheavals. The Soviet Union had 4 constitutions in its life of 74 years, 1918, 1924, 1936 and 1977. In 1991, the rule of the Communist Party of Soviet Union came to an end and soon the Soviet Federation disintegrated. After this political upheaval, the newly formed Russian Federation adopted a new constitution in 1993. But look at India. The Constitution of India was adopted on the 26th of November 1949. Its implementation formally started from the 26th of January 1950. More than 69 years after that, the same constitution continues to function as the framework within which the government of our country operates. Is it that our constitution is so good that it needs no change? Was it that our constitution makers were so far-sighted and wise that they had foreseen all the changes that would take place in the future? In some sense, both the answers are correct. It is true that we have inherited a very robust constitution. The basic framework of the constitution is very much suited to our country. It is also true that the constitution makers were very far-sighted and provided for many solutions for future situations. But no constitution can provide for all eventualities. No document can be such that it needs no change. Then how does the same constitution continue to serve the country? One of the answers to such questions is that our constitution accepts the necessity of modifications according to changing needs of the society. Secondly, in the actual working of the constitution, there has been enough flexibility of interpretations. Both political practice and judicial rulings have shown maturity and flexibility in implementing the Constitution. These factors have made our Constitution a living document rather than a closed and static rulebook. In any society, those responsible for drafting the Constitution at a particular time would face one common challenge: the provisions of the Constitution would naturally reflect efforts to tackle the problems that the society is facing at the time of making of the Constitution. At the same time, the Constitution must be a document that provides the framework of the government for the future as well. Therefore, the Constitution has to be able to respond to the challenges that may arise in the future. In this sense, the Constitution will always have something that is contemporary and something that has a more durable importance. At the same time, a Constitution is not a frozen and unalterable document. It is a document made by human beings and may need revisions, changes and re-examination. It is true that the Constitution reflects the dreams and aspirations of the concerned society. It must also be kept in mind that the Constitution is a framework for the democratic governance of the society. In this sense, it is an instrument that societies create for themselves. This dual role of the Constitution always leads to difficult questions about the status of the Constitution. Is it so sacred that nobody ever can change it? Alternatively, is it so ordinary an instrument that it can be modified just like any other ordinary law? The makers of the Indian Constitution were aware of this problem and sought to strike a balance. They placed the Constitution above ordinary law and expected that the future generations will respect this document. At the same time, they recognized that in the future, this document may require modifications. Even at the time of writing the Constitution, they were aware that on many matters there were differences of opinion. Whenever society would veer toward any particular opinion, a change in the constitutional provisions would be required. Thus, the Indian Constitution is a combination of both the approaches mentioned above, that the Constitution is a sacred document and that it is an instrument that may require changes from time to time. In other words, our Constitution is not a static document, it is not the final word about everything, it is not unalterable. France had numerous constitutions in the last 2 centuries. After the Revolution and during the Napoleonic period, France underwent continuous experimentation about a constitution. The post-revolution constitution of 1793 is called the period of the First French Republic. Then commenced the Second French Republic in 1848. The Third French Republic was formed with a new constitution in 1875. In 1946, with a new constitution, the Fourth French Republic came into being. Finally, in 1958, the Fifth French Republic came into being with yet another constitution. Check your progress. After reading the section above, a number of students in the class were confused. They made the following statements. What would you say about each of these statements? 1. The Constitution is like any other law. It simply tells us what are the rules and regulations governing the government. 2. The Constitution is the expression of the will of the people, so there must be a provision to change the Constitution after every 10 or 15 years. 3. The Constitution is a statement of the philosophy of the country. It can never be changed. 4. The Constitution is a sacred document. Therefore, any talk of changing it is against democracy. How to amend the Constitution? Article 368. Parliament may, in exercise of its constituent power, amend by way of addition, variation, or repeal any provision of this Constitution in accordance with the procedure laid down in this article. We have already seen that the makers of our Constitution wanted to strike a balance. The Constitution must be amended if so required, but it must be protected from unnecessary and frequent changes. In other words, they wanted the Constitution to be flexible, and at the same time, rigid. Flexible means open to changes and rigid means resistant to changes. A constitution that can be very easily changed or modified is often called flexible. In the case of constitutions, which are very difficult to amend, they are described as rigid. The Indian Constitution combines both these characteristics. The makers of the Constitution were aware of the fact that there may be some faults or mistakes in the Constitution. They knew that the Constitution could not be totally free of errors. Whenever such mistakes would come to light, they wanted the Constitution to be easily amended and to be able to get rid of these mistakes. Then there were some provisions in the Constitution that were of temporary nature, and it was decided that these could be altered later on once the new Parliament was elected. But at the same time, the Constitution was framing a federal polity, and therefore, the rights and powers of the states could not be changed without the consent of the states. Some other features were so central to the spirit of the Constitution that the Constitution makers were anxious to protect these from change. These provisions had to be made rigid. These considerations led to different ways of amending the Constitution. There are many articles in the Constitution, which mention that these articles can be amended by a simple law of the Parliament. No special procedure for amendment is required in such cases, and there is no difference at all between an amendment and an ordinary law. These parts of the Constitution are very flexible. Read carefully the following text of some articles of the Constitution. In both these articles, the wording, by law, indicates that these articles can be modified by the Parliament without recourse to the procedure laid down in Article 368. Many other articles of the Constitution can be modified by the Parliament in this simple manner. For amending the remaining parts of the Constitution, provision has been made in Article 368 of the Constitution. In this article, there are two methods of amending the Constitution, and they apply to two different sets of articles of the Constitution. One method is that amendment can be made by special majority of the two houses of the Parliament. The other method is more difficult. It requires special majority of the Parliament and consent of half of the state legislatures. Note that all amendments to the Constitution are initiated only in the Parliament. Besides the special majority in the Parliament, no outside agency, like a Constitution Commission or a separate body, is required for amending the Constitution. Similarly, after the passage in the Parliament and in some cases, in state legislatures, no referendum is required for ratification of the amendment. An amendment bill, like all other bills, goes to the President for his assent, but in this case, the President has no powers to send it back for reconsideration. These details show how rigid and complicated the amending process could have been. Our Constitution avoids these complications. This makes the amendment procedure relatively simple. But more importantly, this process underlines an important principle: only elected representatives of the people are empowered to consider and take final decisions on the question of amendments. Thus, sovereignty of elected representatives, parliamentary sovereignty, is the basis of the amendment procedure. Special majority. In the chapters on election, executive and judiciary, we have come across provisions that require special majority. Let us repeat again what special majority means. Ordinarily, all business of the legislature requires that a motion or resolution or bill should get the support of a simple majority of the members voting at that time. Suppose that at the time of voting on a bill, 247 members were present in the House and all of them participated in the voting on the bill. Then, the bill would be passed if at least 124 members voted in favor of the bill. Not so in the case of an amendment bill. Amendment to the Constitution requires two different kinds of special majorities. In the first place, those voting in favor of the amendment bill should constitute at least half of the total strength of that House. Secondly, the supporters of the amendment bill must also constitute 2/3 of those who actually take part in voting. Both houses of the Parliament must pass the amendment bill separately in this same manner. There is no provision for a joint session. For every amendment bill, this special majority is required. Can you see the significance